Hi there, I'm Nora Bensahel from the Center for a New American Security. I co-direct the Responsible Defense Program with Dave Barno, who's sitting over there. And the two of us were the CNAS team that played through the game that Todd described. The two of us were not the same team that did the first CNAS iteration last May, but we came up with a lot of very similar principles and similar findings to that. Start with a couple of assumptions we made. The first, and I don't think this will be particularly controversial, is that the United States will remain a global power with global responsibilities through the period of the game, the next 10 years. And in particular, we focused on maintaining access, freedom of access to the global commons as one of the key things that the United States will need to do. We did take Todd at his word. We did look at the Defense Strategic Guidance only as guidance, but as we looked through it, we concluded that that was a pretty good place to start in terms of what the military missions are going to be over that 10-year period. I've summarized some of the geographical points up there. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this in terms of the rebalance to Asia and also emphasizing the Middle East, not sizing your force to conduct stability operations and so on. But there are a lot of military missions in there that remain very important, including securing weapons of mass destruction and preventing proliferation and homeland defense as well. We think that the order given to these missions may change in the upcoming National Security Strategy and/or the Quadrennial Defense Review, but as a set of missions that the military needs to conduct, we thought that those were pretty good places to start. Each of the teams here had a strategy for what they added or cut. Our strategy was to take risk in the short to medium term because the United States does not now face a peer competitor. And what that means is, given the level of budget cuts that we are facing, we decided that what we could do is take risk now in order to ensure that we're investing in the systems and capabilities that we will need later on, not just at the end of the first fight up, but going into that second fight up and even beyond that as well. There will still be lesser threats other than a peer competitor conflict coming up that the military must be ready to do. But because of the depth of the cuts, it really does require you to accept a certain amount of risk no matter what programmatic choices you make. As I said, our strategy was to invest military resources for the long run, and in this sense, our perspective actually goes beyond the two fight-ups in the game. We're looking out to having those capabilities be fielded in the third, fourth, maybe even the fifth fight-up beyond the next 10 years. But we think it's very important to be investing now so that you have those capabilities available and in order to see where science and technology and research and development goes, because that path is unpredictable, can lead to breakthrough innovations that may change how we want to structure our military forces and how warfare is conducted in the future. So what did we do? We started off for the first fight up, the full cut scenario. We started by cutting end strength, and we did that to preserve as much readiness as possible. One of the things that we found in doing this is that in order to achieve the sequestration level cuts, you have to take big cuts out of either end strength, readiness, or both. And so we started by having very heavy cuts to DoD civilians. Even though we sort of understand Tom's caution on that, the number of civilians in DoD has grown very significantly over the past 10 years. And as we're shrinking the force, as I'll talk about in a minute, the number of civilians should come down as well with that. We did, however, cut the end strength of all the military services. The Army took the biggest cut of any of the services here. We brought that down from the programmatic level of 490,000 to 420,000. That is in line with what the Army itself has now said, and we were kind of surprised when we were comparing the results of all the think tanks. As Todd will mention, we are the Army champions. That's the highest level of Army force structure you're going to see from the four teams here today. Even with those cuts to personnel, though, we couldn't get around cutting some readiness. We tried to minimize that, but most of the services, all the services but the Marine Corps, we did have to reduce some readiness in order to achieve the savings. I've listed some of the other programmatic cuts that we made. We took very heavy cuts out of tactical fighters, particularly retiring legacy fighters and cutting the F-35 buy. Cutting some naval surface ships, as you see there, a little bit of ground force structure, and in particular, the one area of defense reforms that we did have an option of playing in the game was there were a couple of options related to a BRAC that I think Todd will talk about a little bit later, and we did take both of those that were available to us. We decided, though, even in the very, very budget-constrained first FYDP, that there were specific areas we wanted to reinvest in to make sure that we were having enough capabilities for the future to build on. And so we added back money, very small amounts of it, in a number of different areas in line with our strategy. And again, we started with science and technology and investments there, invested some money in some cyber capabilities, more recent fighters to replace some of the legacy ones that we had retired, and in particular unmanned ISR and certain kinds of capabilities for A2AD environments. That was the first FYDP. What we found is that making those levels of cuts, what you have to do to get to the level of cuts that are required in the first FYDP actually gives you considerable amount of downstream savings in the second FYDP. So we didn't actually have to cut the whole $114 billion by new choices in the second FYDP scenario. We had accrued a lot of savings from, the out years of what we had cut in the first FYDP, which was nice. What that meant is it gave us a lot of money to reinvest in the second FYDP. And the strategy that we used, again, was very similar to what I've described before. Science and technology, space, cyber and communications, those are lumped together because they were lumped together in the game. So I will talk about that as a category, even though it involves very different things. We sustained investments in certain types of naval ships and, again, in unmanned ISR and strike. And we did go back and reverse some of the cuts we had made in the first FYDP. We brought the Army end strength back up to 450,000, seeing the value in that as a hedge against uncertainty, but also ground forces being used as a deterrent force around the world, and also as a hedge against not knowing where the future of science and technology and new capabilities will take us, and an ability to reshape those forces in the event that we do find ourselves fighting in a different kind of conflict environment. So this is the summary of the cuts that we did. This comes directly from the tool that Todd showed you. I want to point out that that giant downward-facing red line for personnel does include all of the DoD civilians and contractors. It looks far more severe than it would if you had just included the cuts to military personnel. But as you'll see, that's the area where we took most of, where we harvested most of the savings. And where on the very left, where you see the air numbers, a lot of that growth in green, where we decided to reinvest over the course of both FYDPs, this chart rolls up both of them, is in that area of, particularly of space. We then went on to the second scenario that Todd described, where the half BCA scenario, and we essentially took all of the choices we had made for the full sequestration scenario and imported them here as our starting point. And again, so our task was then to buy back some capabilities from the new baseline that we had created of the sequestration, the BCA level cuts in the first move. And again, we significantly increased funding now in the first FYDP for science and technology, investments of more than $30 billion, and then almost doubling it in the second FYDP. Similar dynamics for S&T funding. Something that was very interesting to us is when we bought back a lot of that in the first FYDP, we actually didn't need to put as much in the second FYDP into research, because we were finding that we were spending that money on further development and fielding of actual systems. So you see those systems coming online much more quickly. And in most of the other areas, we remained the same as the full BCA scenario. The shape of that chart should look very familiar to you. It's very similar to the one that I showed before, but what I've highlighted here is you can see that the additional green bars in the areas of science and technology and in space, cyber and communications are significantly increased over the full sequestration scenario. Just a couple of words to conclude. We were quite taken, as we played through the exercise, how very hard it is to reach the budget savings without tackling personnel readiness or both. And again, I think a lot of us knew this intuitively, but when you start getting in there and mucking around with the numbers, it's very hard to get to the level of savings that you need through programmatic cuts if you try to keep these areas untouched. What's very interesting, though, is it does save a lot of money down line. So we were able to, in the second FYDP, so we were able to reverse a lot of those cuts. What that tells us is that the way that these cuts are implemented may not be the most strategic possible if you're having to cut things to reach the budget numbers, and then as soon as you have more money, turning around and recreating them. So it indicates a strategic problem that's inherent to the BCA level cuts. I want to conclude with a point that I think all of the panelists here will agree on, and what both Representative Smith and Senator McCain said this morning. This tool doesn't talk about defense reform in the areas of overhead, BRAC and infrastructure. There's a little bit in there, but not very much. Compensation and healthcare. And it's essential to tackle these things in order to free resources to avoid some of the hard choices that we had to make in the area of capabilities and end strength in this game. CNAS published last year a report called The 7 Deadly Sins of Defense Spending. I love this. It's my favorite CNAS cover ever because it shows a $100 bill going up in flames. And what the report talks about is estimates possible savings in a lot of these areas. And the bottom line of the report is that relatively modest changes, significant but not wholesale changes, in those areas that I mentioned could actually mitigate most, if not all, of the cuts in this scenario that would enable you to avoid making some of those choices that are not particularly strategic in the first FYDP in order to achieve the level of savings that you need. And I think all of the members of this panel, the institutions, and well as several other think tanks in town have been very active in trying to promote this issue. And I think it's something that's really important to talk about and keep as context when you look at the cuts that we made, both in personnel and in programmatic structures. Thanks.